So here's my book, Deleting the State. The working title of the book was Freedom, Authority, and Social Order, and the book really concerns the relationship between those three things. I was interested in the nature and justification of political authority when I first started out working on these things. And what I found is that the coercive power of the state is not necessary for there to be sufficient social cooperation to have a society. The theoretical justifications that are traditionally offered by philosophers turn out not to be that valid. My chief nemesis, if you will, would be the philosopher Hobbes, who argued that if we weren't all afraid of the sovereign, we'd all be at each other's throats constantly, and social cooperation would be impossible. Literally, the fear of being put to death by the sovereign is the only thing that keeps us in line and makes it possible for us to cooperate. But it turns out that that's just not true. Not only is there philosophical reasons to think that that's not true, but what I discovered was that in the history of law, in the evolution of societies, that there's empirical evidence that it's not true. So my research involved the traditional philosophical arguments about these things, but I also looked outside of philosophy. I looked at economics and game theory. I looked at law and the history of law and the history of societies, not just in the Anglo-American legal culture, but also many other cultures from different parts of the world, from Iceland to New Guinea. And it turns out that there's not only philosophical reasons to be skeptical of the Hobbesian argument that we couldn't possibly cooperate without the fear of death being ever present, but also that there's plenty of empirical evidence that social cooperation is possible and that it can and does arise as a spontaneous order, the natural result of people's attempts to live together in community settings. So the book represents part of the book has its origins in my doctoral thesis, and then others involve later developments of my work, the inclusion of some specific arguments pertaining to disaster relief, to the provision of food on a global market, and to further work in economics and law that I've done since leaving graduate school. I don't argue in favor of blowing up buildings or anything like that. The title that the book was eventually published under, Deleting the State, doesn't refer to any sort of violent overthrow of the government, but rather to the theoretical undermining of the necessity of government as a vital component of social order and cooperation, which turn out to be things that people are capable of doing all on their own. There are a variety of problems that we look to government to solve, many of which, it turns out, can be solved in other ways. There are problems of laziness of thought, wherein we can't imagine anything being other than the way it is. Simple example might be that when I was a child, for example, sanitation removal was a municipal function. Now many of us live in communities where the government's not needed to provide sanitation removal. If you had asked me when I was a child how would the trash be taken away if it weren't for these municipal employees, I don't think I would have been able to come up with an answer. But a lack of imagination on my part about that sort of thing doesn't count as evidence. The fundamental question about government turns out to be, can we have the minimal level of social cooperation that's necessary to ensure a functioning society without the government? Do we need the government to make us cooperate with each other? And there's plenty of evidence that that's not true. But if we start blowing up buildings, that's not going to solve any problems whatsoever, so I don't advocate that sort of violence. And there's a section in the book in which I explain why that's a bad idea.